Hi and welcome sa channel. So today, i-unbox natin tong infamous RX 6500 XT. So wala pang benchmarks today and I will post one by Wednesday siguro since di ko pa tapos yung ibang benchmarks. I bought this infamous card for almost 15,000 pesos from Tech 2027 and it was delivered 2 days later. For the reason why infamous siya, either Google nyo na lang or search sa YouTube. Pero basically maraming disappointed. Ang isang disappointing thing for me ay yung walang streaming capabilities. So wala siyang hardware encoder. Whereas in one of my videos, I demonstrated na yung RX 550 merong streaming capabilities and may hardware encoder siya. So yung hardware encoder, hindi lang yun pang streaming, no? Pag mahilig ka mag-video edit or other GPU tasks, pwede siyang magamit. So dahil tinipid tayo ni AMD, wala tong hardware encoder. Also on streaming, kahit gamitin mo yung Radeon Software Adrenaline, wala ka rin makikita. As good as GT 1030 tong card na to in terms of streaming. Basically, gagamit ka ng CPU if you want to stream with this card. Anyway, ito yung Sapphire Pulse Edition. If you don't know Sapphire, usually may Nitro Plus line sila. Pero for this card na RX 6600 and this RX 6500 XT, walang Nitro Plus. Pulse lang yung meron. Difference usually ay yung cooling performance and RGB. So, itong Pulse, bale wala tong RGB, no? Nasa lower tier din ito sa Sapphire lineup. Sa box, ang sabi niya ay 1080p gaming, may 4GB GDDR6 memory, saka PCIe Gen 4 support. Gen 4 pero parang Gen 4 with disabilities, which I will tackle later. Tapos RDNA 2 architecture daw siya. Sa likod ng box, may isang product specification output lang siya, which is DisplayPort and HDMI. Isang port bali ng DisplayPort at HDMI. Tapos may minimum system requirement siya kung ilalagay mo siya sa PC mo. Then halos wala nang information. So ito is more of legal related and copyright. So yun, very basic yung box ni Sapphire. Sa gilid, merong konting information, RDNA 2, DirectX 12, Fidelity FX Super Resolution, FreeSync, GDDR6 memory, saka PCIe Express 4.0 support. These are basic na dapat naman talaga kasama sa specifications. Sa other side, wala na. Pansin nyo medyo napunit na siya. Ito, napunit na siya yung box. Very small yung box niya and very tight sa loob. So nung pinakuuli yung GPU sa loob, napunit siya. Comparing lang with the 1650 box, ganito siya. So mas maliit talaga by a lot. Pero yung GPU itself is not that small kumpara doon sa 1650. I'll show later. And then comparing naman with the 6800, yung 6800 halos sakto lang siya sa frame ng camera. Pero ito yung 6500 XT. Parang mag-ama lang sila sa liit. Opening the box. So sa loob nitong box na to may maliit pang box. Isa pa, recyclable daw siya. Then sa loob ng karton, ito yung GPU mismo na naka-plastic. Tapos may dalawa siyang loose foam na padding. So very loose siya. Kaya pag minsan nung pinak ko siya, hindi maganda yung pagkakapak. Kaya napunit yung box. So yun. Hindi siya tulad ng iba na maganda yung padding. So sa ilalim, merong manual. Saka information ni Sapphire. Hindi ko magets kung bakit gustong-gusto nila itong information nila. So, ito na mismo yung GPU. Okay, so ito yung GPU. It's black and red na theme, no? Actually, very, very pretty siya, in my opinion. I could say na that's expected from Sapphire. So may dalawa siyang, I think this is an 85mm fan, kung di ko nagkakamali. I could be wrong, di ko sinukat. As for the heatsink, 2 comments, no? One is, I think this is sufficient enough. It ran around 4 to 5 degrees cooler than the 1650 at a way lower fan speed, no? So usually ito mga nasa 50% lang yung fan, hindi umaangat doon. So yan din yung isang quirk ni Sapphire. They are very confident sa kanilang cooling. Mahina yung fan pero malamig yung GPU. Second comment sa heatsink is mukhang isang block lang ito. So hindi siya yung katulad nung Nitro Plus na merong hiwalay na heatsink for the memory module. So ito mukhang isang block lang to. So sa Nitro Plus ang standard nila dalawa yung heatsink blocks, no? Isa for the GPU core, tapos mayroong isang maliit na separate for VRAM and VRM. Reason dito is to isolate the heat ng GPU sa VRAM and VRM. Pero mukhang sa Nitro Plus lang yun and wala dito sa Pulse. So comparing lang yung size, so ito yung 1650, so mas maiksi siya than the 6500 XT. Pero yung taas is almost the same. Magkasing taas halos yung sila. I think magkasing taas talaga sila. Yun. Pero yung box, mas maliit yung box nito. Very compact. Nasa website naman yung dimensions, which is basically 194mm by 120mm. Tapos dual slot siya. And then sa ports merong HDMI, saka merong DisplayPort. So yung mga ports merong covers, pero yung PCIe connector wala siyang cover. Then since nandito na tayo sa PCIe connector, babalikan ko lang yung sinasabi ng AMD na PCIe Gen 4 ito. So yes, this is a PCIe Gen 4 card, pero it's only using by 4 lanes or X4, no? Makikita daw yun sa circuitry nitong graphics card. So close up lang natin. So ito, may circuit siya dito. Pero hanggang dito lang siya. Papansin nyo dito, walang circuit. So, dami lang to, no? Wala talaga siyang connectivity. So, kahit anong gawin mo dyan, okay lang. So, ito lang yung ginagamit. Pero kailangan mo siya isaksak sa by 16 na slot. Ibig sabihin yan, pag sa Gen 4 mo sinaksak tong GPU na to, yung bandwidth mo is 7.8 gigabytes per second. Pero pag sa Gen 3 mo sinaksak tong graphics card na to, yung bandwidth mo is kalahati lang, which is 3.93 gigabytes per second. So kung 8 gigabyte GPU to, okay lang. Kung internet mo yung pinag-uusapan sa 3.93 gigabytes per second, okay lang din yun, no? Pero yung pinag-uusapan dito is yung transfer from GPU to system memory. So kung kukulangin ka ng VRAM o say AAA games yung nilalaro mo, ang gagawin ng GPU makikipag-usap siya sa CPU mo para maglagay ng textures sa system RAM mo. So 4 gigabytes per second in texture and in graphics term is very slow. It's very slow. Mararamdaman siya. I think in AAA titles benchmark na na-try ko na ramdam siya, no, nag-i-stutter talaga. And as on how to know kung naka Gen 4 ka, based on the combination of CPU and motherboard, which is konti lang yung naka Gen 4 basically. So enumerate natin. For CPU, kung Ryzen 3000 series ka na non-G or Ryzen 5000 series na non-G din, tapos paired with a B550 or an X570. And then pag Intel 11th Gen processor ka on H510, B560, H570, and Z590 motherboard, so yun, Gen 4 capable din yung combination na yun. Lastly, yung 12th Gen processor with their corresponding motherboards, lahat yun, Gen 4 na. So, in short, konti lang. Those are CPUs and motherboards that was released for the past 2 to 3 years lang. So, very few lang yun, no? So, for sure yung ibang viewers dito, naka Gen 3 na motherboard. Even for my test bench, naka Gen 3 siya. So, ito, itetest ko siya on Gen 3. Since yun yung realistic, no? Realistically speaking, mas konti yung naka Gen 4. For power, it requires a 6-pin single power cable. And then lastly, the backplate. So may backplate na siya. So this is my first card data na nagsasalita ako na may backplate, no. So usually walang backplate yung mga GPU. So maganda yung backplate ng Sapphire Pulse. Actually maganda lagi yung backplate ng Sapphire. Pero for aesthetics lang to, sadly, no. Sa Nitro Plus kasi may thermal pads yung VRMs dito sa backplate. So yung backplate kasi ang isa pa niyang purpose is heat spreader para yung heat mag-dissipate dito sa backplate. Then kung may CPU fan ka, pwede yung mapalamig ng CPU fan mo, no. Ayun, pero in this case, aesthetics lang to. So I tried na sipatin kung may thermal pad siya. So hindi kita dito. Pero yun, sinipat ko siya on, ito, kita, ayan, puro mga circuit lang siya. Wala siyang thermal pad. Ayan. Actually, kitang-kita yung thermal pad sa Nitro Plus na graphics card. So, itong Pulse, wala siyang, thermal pad. Sayang kasi sana heat spreader. Pero wala magagawa. This is their entry-level type of card, no? Yung Nitro Plus yung, nila, higher tier na card. Pero overall, sabi ko nga kanina, malamig yung takbo ng graphics card na to. So kahit hindi siya Nitro Plus standard, Sapphire standard pa rin tong graphics card na to. So it still performs well. Yung mayabang na fan curve ni Sapphire, andito pa rin. So 66 degrees na yung GPU, pero 40% pa rin yung fan. So yung ganong yabang ng fan curve, nandito pa rin. Which means na kung tune mo yung fan curve nito, it can be cooler. Pero ang habol kasi ni Sapphire dito is yung balance ng quietness and coolness. Madalas ganun yung napansin ko sa Sapphire, no? Hindi sila mahilig na maingay yung card, no? Then hindi rin sila mahilig na mabigat yung card. So tama lang yung gaan, tama lang yung heatsink design, tama lang lahat, balance lahat. Hindi ako Sapphire spokesperson pero napansin ko lang. Pero for 6500 XT overall, ang unang masasabi ko is if you're a streamer or a content editor, no, or content creator, video editor or something na gumagamit ng encoder sa GPU, this 6500 XT is a big no. You should skip it kung yun yung line of work mo or yun yung ginagawa mo sa buhay. So I guess na-cover ko na lahat ng tungkol sa Sapphire graphics card ng 6500 XT. So ayun, be wary on buying this card kasi nga crippled siya. So itong Pi 4 lanes na to is an example of how AMD crippled this card. And then next is yung hardware encoder, which is wala, no? Non-existent talaga. Again, sayang lang. So if you are just gaming, no, wala kang pakialam sa hardware encoder, hindi ka video editor, do wait for the benchmarks. I will benchmark this against its competitor in current price, which is the 1650. So yun yung lalabas by Wednesday. I think the other tech tubers have already given their piece of mind kung ano tong 6500 XT, but if you're willing to wait for my benchmarks as well. So that's all for now. Thanks for watching. Do like or dislike, subscribe for more unboxing and benchmarks. Bye.